Hi, everyone. This is going to be another episode, number 21, of our famous quotes on Paul. This time we're going to examine the earliest Muslims who discuss Paul, usually critically, but in ways that may seem unusual to anticipate. We'll explain that in a second. Oxford lecture by Dr. Whittingham discussed this recently. There is no date at the website that hosts his audio, so I'm going to assume it was recently. He is a Dr. Martin Whittingham from Oxford. He is involved apparently in the Center for Muslim Christian Studies, and very academic, very clear, not too ponderous. And so I'm going to play his lecture audio. I've transcribed it, or I've had it automatically transcribed, and I'll run that transcription on the screen. Before I get there, I just want to give you a heads up of what the main point is that he's getting at. Is there's no attack or criticism of Paul or comment on Paul in the Quran or anything in the early literature they call the Hadith, and I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, or their commentaries. I would assume that meant it's all the way 100 or more years later than Muhammad in the 700s, and then it's where there's one theory proposed, and then it's silence for 400 years, and then somebody comes up with another theory about Paul. And so one of the theories is that Paul actually was a good, true Jew who, on behalf of the Jewish leadership, infiltrated Christianity to make it repulsive to Jews, to save Jews from Christianity. That was one theory. And the second theory was, and by the way, that was partly circulated in a book that was designed from Jewish people to attack Christianity and undermine it, and then claim that Paul was a good Jew who was trying to help us by having all these horrible things attached to Christ, and we would then know that he's not to be followed. Okay, so and by the way, that could be a reflection of their knowing the high priest who serves the Herodian family basically could have been co-opting Paul concurrently with the Romans and Herodians. uh, the Herodians worked with the high priest, just the high priest, not the lower order priest. So maybe this is this first theory actually reflects truth, and you're going to see the second theory reflects the same truth, but about the Romans. And the second theory is Paul was an infiltrator serving Roman interests to turn Christianity to be compliant from Rome's perspective. So I think actually both things are simultaneously true. That's what's so ironic. They're not mutually exclusive. Again, you have to know the high priest is not a true representative of the Jewish people. That's why they had to turn to, in the late 60s, they turned to James, the leader of the Christian church, the Christian movement. They asked him, can you do the Yom Kippur service? This is all documented in Josephus's work. And basically he agrees and he does that. And then the appointed, Herodian appointed high priest basically kills him in a terrible way and kills James. And so that shows you that the Jewish people were turning to somebody who's not even a technical, uh, exclusively Jewish person. It's somebody who was a Christian leader and the brother of Jesus, James, the brother of Jesus. They turned to him because they had confidence that he was better than the Herodian family. So anyway, so there could have been these two theories are not mutually exclusive. I just want you to bear that in mind. And so let's listen now to his video.
Some of these Muslim accounts, and really the most important one that I want to draw attention to today, is by someone called Saif bin Umar at-Tamimi. That's the second work on the primary sources. Saif bin Umar died in the period somewhere around 796 to 809, but really no one's quite sure. Virtually nothing is known about him. Doesn't sound too promising, does it? We don't know when he died and we don't know anything about him, so why are we talking about it? Well, the reason is his fame rests on the fact that At-Tabari, this incredibly famous historian and writer, chose him as the main source of his accounts of the early wars of apostasy and conquest. So we know him through that. However, he's often also regarded as unreliable, and there are complaints by other Muslim writers about identifying the transmitters in the reports he uses and general wariness of him. Interestingly, Tabari uses Saif in various ways, but he completely ignores his account of Paul, which we're about to come to. Tabari just leaves that aside. It doesn't enter Tabari's history. Saif's account of Paul is much earlier than most Muslim accounts of Paul. Now, Sean Anthony says earlier than most. He may be hedging his bet slightly because neither he nor anyone else mentions any earlier one. But it's probably a bolder claim to say this is the earliest, but it's certainly very early if we're talking about late 700s. And his point in writing about Paul, fairly briefly, is to warn Muslims to beware of divisive figures who will undermine true religion. And he makes an explicit comparison that I'll come back to shortly with someone called Ibn Sabah, who is regarded as likewise a corrupter of true religion and who lies at the origins of Shi'ism. So you have Paul and Ibn Sabah, these two figures that exist in parallel. Anyway, in Saif's account of Paul, King Paul, he's a king in this account, says about certain Jews who have decided to follow Jesus. This is what Paul says in the account. He's saying to his fellow Jews, this Christian's message is appealing, and some Jews have gone to your enemy being the Christians. They are still acting as the followers of Jesus, mistaken ones. They are still acting as the benefactors of the Christians, these Jews who have gone over. Soon they will come riding against you with the aid of your enemies, unless you pay heed to what I am about to say to you now. And then he pursued them with the intent to lead them astray. Now, it's a few pages. If I'd had time, I would have reproduced the entire short account of Paul from this, but I will try to give you the gist. I'm sorry I didn't have time. It's translated in Sean Anthony's article. It's not very long. Paul's plan, then, is to cause the Christians to be damned by introducing a false version of their faith, okay? And thereby to save the Jews, so that Jews will not be attracted. It might all sound a little bit complicated, but this is what's going on. I hope I'm trying to make it clear enough. So Paul introduces false teaching that he attaches to the teachings of Jesus, if you like. This is the main point. The idea being in Saif bin Umar's account to prevent Jews from being attracted to it. What is this false teaching? Well, for example, declaring all foods as clean. There's another quote saying, from Paul in this account, everything from the beetle to the elephant is licit, is permitted to be eaten. Okay? In other words, abandoning Jewish food laws. And I will return to the significance of this particular quotation later in a different context. What else does this King Paul, the deceiver, teach? He teaches that Christians should abandon the proper direction of prayer, abandon the law, as I've mentioned, and abandon the right to wage military jihad, replacing it with turning the other cheek. Okay? So it's various things that Paul is understood to be introducing. Paul gathers together Jacob, Nastur, Malkun, and someone called the Believer. And these first three names lie behind the Jacobites, the Nestorians, the Melkites, which are the three big Eastern Christian groups. And they together produce the idea of Jesus as God's Son. And the believer in this little cohort is horrified. This is a true believer. He's horrified by this false idea that Jesus is God's Son. Saif draws a parallel, as I said, between Paul and Ibn Sabah, supposed early corrupter of Islam and instigator of what became Shi'ism. And in fact, this is Saif bin Umar's real concern. His real concern is to do with Islam. It's not really to do with Paul and Christianity. But Paul and Christianity is an illustration. Look what happens when you let someone in who twists things. Okay? So Paul is an interesting example, a warning of a parallel case where the faith did indeed become corrupted. So he's saying this has already happened in the past in the case of Christianity. Don't let it happen in the present. Okay? I'll just pause to read you one or two more excerpts from Saif's actual account. If I can pick them up here, just to give you a flavour. So, for example, on the prohibition of jihad, he said, Paul said, "I think that no one ought to be harmed and no one recompensed. So whoever does evil to you, do not give him what he deserves. If one slaps his cheek, let him turn to him the other, and if he takes some of his clothing, let him give the rest of it." They accepted this and abandoned jihad. This is the people he's gone over to and is now deceiving. If you see what I mean. And I'll just read you a clip from the crucial beginning. So Paul says, as I read, this message of the Christians is appealing to some. So he left his kingdom and wore there the Christians' clothes. We don't know what that means. Then he pursued them with the intent to lead them astray. And they took him, saying, "Praise be to God who has humbled you and taken your power from you." And Paul replied, "Lead me to your leaders." And they led him to the leaders, whereupon they said, "What do you have to say?" They invite Paul to tell them, and he says, "Jesus found me while I was departing from you, and took from me my hearing, my sight, and my reason. I neither heard nor saw nor reasoned." This is the experience on the road to Damascus. "Soon after he healed me, and by God I gave an oath to join your cause, to dedicate my life to you, and to teach you the Torah and its laws. And they believed that he spoke the truth." And this is the deception. Okay? And the very last line of this account is when he's talked about all sorts of things. And the like of Paul in this community, the Muslim community, is Ibn Sabah. And those of you who like to pursue early Islamic history, you can read about him. Now there are other accounts later on which are similar in some ways but with different details, but this idea of the conspirator, Paul the conspirator. So for example you have, I know these works aren't well known, ad-Damiri, who died in 1405, much later, but in a book of his he's attributing a similar-ish account of Paul to someone very early, saying this comes from Al-Kalbi, who died in 763. Now this is different from Saif bin Umar's account in many details, although the overall framework is similar, including Paul's motivation. And you do find this, that the motive is the motive to save the Jews, as in Saif bin Umar. Well, not always. In ad-Damiri, the motive is his concern, Paul's concern that Jesus' message might be true, and that he and fellow Jews might therefore be damned. So he wants to mislead Christians away from Jesus' true message so as to damn them along with himself. So it's kind of similar but different. Now, more famously, you have Abd al-Jabbar, the most famous classical Muslim account of Paul as corrupter and conspirator, given by the Mu'tazilite judge of Ray near modern Tehran, Qadi Abd al-Jabbar, often known as Qadi, the judge Abd al-Jabbar. And Gabriel Said Reynolds, who was actually with us at the centre a year or so ago, he's produced this translation of the relevant work by Abd al-Jabbar, English translation, parallel text with the Arabic, again, for those of you who want to pursue it. That's listed on the handout. So let me just say a little about Abd al-Jabbar. He was born around 937 in modern-day Iran, as I say, and rose to become a very wealthy chief judge of Ray. I mean, he's much more well-known than these other people I've been talking about, before falling from grace amidst the political intrigues of his day. He rose to become the chief exponent of the Mu'tazilite school of a somewhat more rationalist Muslim theology. So he's very famous for that. On his death in 1025, he left behind a large number of works on Muslim theology, and most importantly for our purposes, this critique of Christianity involving an account of Paul. The work it's called The Confirmation of the Proofs of Prophethood. It's about proving the prophethood of Muhammad. So again, the actual focus and concern is Islamic. And there were many, many works like this about the prophethood of Muhammad. Now this work disputes the claims of Christianity to be based on the genuine teachings of Christ. Again, this split between Jesus and historic Christianity. Abd al-Jabbar rejects Christianity's historical basis in order to support the central claim of his work, the prophethood of Muhammad. So everything he says about Paul is in the service of this cause. According to Abd al-Jabbar, some early Christians joined the side of the Romans, the ruling power, and perverted the true gospel teaching. And one of the key figures entangled with Rome was Paul. According to Abd al-Jabbar, the motive of Paul in this early Christian scheming is rooted in the same character flaw as found in those other Christians who went over to the Romans to oppose the Jews. That is the desire for power and dominance. So it's a very kind of basic instinct, if you like, here. Paul wants to be dominant. Paul, quote, desired leadership and dominion and used every kind of plot to this end. Now, Paul's links with Rome are not expounded at length by Abd al-Jabbar, but he writes of Paul as, quote, going along with the Romans in their religion and deviating from the religion of Christ, unquote. Now, for Abd al-Jabbar, Paul's motivation for corrupting Christian teaching, as I said, is power, as opposed to saving the Jews, for example. Rather different. And different from Saif bin Umar in its details, but still with the idea of a plot. Okay. Now, what's interesting is that these people, all these different writers, all have a similar framework of Paul as conspirator, pretending to go over to the Christian side, but not really. But lots of the details and the motivations are a bit different. So it seems more likely that they are drawing on a shared source rather than, for example, all of them going back to Saif bin Umar, because they don't reproduce his account faithfully. There's other things in the mix here, and we'll talk about that shortly. Abbas Barzagar, who's mentioned, listed as the bottom of the handout there, he has an article on this about Paul and Ibn Sabah. These previously unknown names to sometimes become very familiar as you see a whole cohort of people writing about them. Barzagar argues that Sunni self-legitimation required identifying figures who were corruptors, independent of the strength of the historical evidence for such a stance. There's a quote from Barzagar: the historical inaccuracy, and he puts the in brackets, the historical inaccuracy of Muslim accounts of Paul of Tarsus tell us more about the mythic power of his representation and his role therein as a critical component of Muslim identity formation than they do about the actual person of Paul. Should I read that again, or is that digestible? Read it again. The historical inaccuracy of Muslim accounts of Paul of Tarsus tell us more about the mythic power of his representation and his role therein as a critical component of Muslim identity formation than they do about the actual person of Paul. So again, it's drawing the boundaries of the legitimate community. True teachings of Jesus, likewise again true teachings of Islam and Ibn Sabah, but obviously also Jesus as an Islamic figure too. And Paul and Ibn Sabah as corruptors of this. The key issue is the need to explain what went wrong with an originally true set of teachings and how large numbers were misled. Just briefly, a third motive for Paul's scheming occurs in the Quran commentary of Ath-Thalabi. I haven't actually listed that, who died in 1035. Writing in relation to Surah 9:31, Ath-Thalabi states that Paul concludes that Christianity is true, considers himself damned, and then seeks to consign Christians to hell along with himself. So it's similar to Ad-Damiri. And the relevant text is translated in, I should have put down Gabriel Said Reynolds' other book, which is a study of Abd al-Jabbar. And he translates the relevant piece. Now, finally, as an example of a Muslim view, we have the famous polemicist Ibn Hazm, who died in 1064, famous for his absolutely brutal excoriation of all sorts of people, not just Christians, Jews, Muslims that he disagreed with were a major target as well. And he cites the Jews themselves as saying that Paul plotted. I mean, he's quite clear that Paul is a liar, as are Matthew and Mark and Luke, and he's just dreadful people. They're all wretches and deceivers and so forth. So Paul is not alone in this, in Ibn Hazm's work. But Ibn Hazm says that the Jews themselves say that their ancestors agreed to bribe the Benjamite Paul, God curse him, and to give him the task of disguising himself as an adherent of the religion of Jesus, to lead his companions astray and to drive them to hold Jesus as divine. Okay. So in other words, Ibn Hazm is saying this is what the Jews themselves say, that they arranged this plot. So it's slightly different from just describing it, but Ibn Hazm is saying, I heard this from Jews, effectively. And Ibn Hazm makes exactly the same comparison as Saif ibn Umar, that the Jews, as well as trying to corrupt the true teachings of Jesus successfully, also tried the same thing with Islam. I should have said this earlier, that Ibn Sabah is a Yemenite Jew who pretends to convert to Islam and corrupts it. So we have two Jews who try to corrupt true religion. This is the thread. Now here we see one of two things. Either Saif bin Umar's account is being used and reproduced about 300 years later by Ibn Hazm and others along the way as a direct source. But actually this again doesn't seem that likely. Ibn Hazm again has different details, including Ibn Sabah introducing the divinity of Ali as a Shiite belief, which isn't mentioned by Saif ibn Umar at all, and other differences too. So it seems more likely that there is an underlying story about Paul's scheming circulating so widely that different versions of it were available to Muslims. And it's to this underlying story that I want to move on now. Now, there's a work called Toledot Yeshu, which is listed on the handout here. It literally means that I'm not a Hebraist at all, but I think the generations of Jesus, effectively the life of Jesus. There is no fixed text for this collection of stories. Your hearts may sink when you want clear distilled data, but this circulated in various kinds of texts. It's a Jewish anti-gospel, okay, which circulated very widely across Europe and the Middle East, and we know this from manuscripts occurring in different places and different languages and through different centuries. And this has recently, if anyone's interested, this has recently been the subject of extremely detailed study. It's been studied before since the late 19th century, but here we have two volumes, a two-volume study from 2011, a project from Princeton University, gathering manuscripts and giving an English translation of about 7 different versions of this text, if we can call it a text, and then a whole series of papers about it as well in a separate volume. So I would refer you to that if you wanted information. There are also a host of other academic articles on it. Now, there's a big dispute about the dating of this. Sorry, I'll backtrack. It's a Jewish anti-gospel which is full of accounts like the fact that Jesus is born of the union of Mary and her next door neighbour who either rapes her or it's adultery. There's something, very unseemly going on. Jesus is a sorcerer. He gains his power by stealing the divine name. There's all sorts of things go on. He is crucified on a cabbage stalk because Jesus had exerted his magical power over trees so that no tree would bear him. But they then found something else which wasn't a tree to crucify him on. It's all these kinds of accounts. And then following this, in some manuscripts, this anti-gospel, there is an anti-Acts, where you have accounts of the apostles, fairly briefly, wherein you get again this idea that Paul, the plotter, deliberately goes over to corrupt the false teachings of Christianity. And as I say, it's not in all manuscripts. But it is in some. Now, obviously there's an interesting and important question about the dating of this, if you like, fluid but identifiable collection of stories which is circulating. Some of the motifs that are found in Toledot Yeshu are very early. You find a story about the gardener stealing the body of Jesus from the tomb. This is mentioned by Tertullian, the church father, who died in around 220. And that particular story, which is not really found anywhere else, occurs in Toledot Yeshu, versions of it. And that doesn't necessarily mean that Toledot Yeshu, as we now have it, had coalesced that early. So there's quite a bit of scholarship debating. Now the dating of this obviously is relevant to whether it could have an influence on Saif ibn Umar. The first reference to Toledot Yeshu as a written composition is by Agobard, Bishop of Lyon in France, who died in 840. So actually pretty contemporary to Saif ibn Umar. But the material does go back earlier than that, some of it circulating. There is one striking verbal similarity of versions of Toledot Yeshu to Saif ibn Umar, and this is this statement: everything from the beetle to the elephant, or a word for a tiny insect, from a mosquito to the elephant, is licit, is permitted. You find that in both. So while Toledot Yeshu may not have directly influenced all the accounts, the Muslim accounts that we read, obviously Saif ibn Umar himself is one influence. It seems to be that you have this influence around. This is despite the fact that it's very hostile to Jesus, which would not be a Muslim position, obviously. But how do we know that Toledot Yeshu did influence Saif ibn Umar and not the other way round? Well, these are always probabilities rather than definitive facts. Let's think about plausibility for a moment. The story of Paul corrupting Christian teaching fits well as part of Jewish-Christian debate. Two faiths competing over a key figure at the centre of the differences between them. But for Saif bin Umar or other Muslims to have generated this story, it seems to me, makes less sense. Yes, Paul explains how Jesus' true teaching was lost, but why the stories of preserving Judaism? It seems more likely that these stories circulated widely as Jewish narratives, first in Aramaic in the Palestinian area, and were then borrowed or absorbed by Saif ibn Umar. There is another possible Jewish precedent for the idea of Paul being an originator of Christian beliefs, much briefer and without the conspiracy theorizing. Jewish polemics against Christianity as the sole focus of a book begin with Dawood al-Muqammis, who died in 937, and his book Kitab ad-Dara'a, his writing in Arabic, the book of urging on to attack, parts of which are preserved in another work. One has to do some digging to... Not all of these early sources are preserved in their own right. And here we read that the Christians themselves claimed that, quote, Paul and Peter laid down for them laws and regulations found neither in the Gospels nor in the Torah, unquote. So this is more other Jewish works saying that Paul really added to what was going on. And just one more example of this tradition, the famous, I use the word famous too much in this seminar, the commentator Rashi, Jewish commentator, French Jew who died in 1105. And in his commentary on the Babylonian Talmud, he gives this comment: because Israel was in distress because of the trickeries of Jesus, Peter and Paul, quote, created nonsense for them in order to keep them apart from them, to keep the Jews apart from the Christians, the people, and to remove them from Israel. This is to protect Jews and Judaism. They were not heretics, i.e. converts to Christianity, Peter and Paul, for they did everything for the benefit of Israel. Okay. So let me turn to implications just for a few minutes. Now we can see from these accounts of the Jewish sources that they want to reclaim Paul as a good Jew, doing what he did to preserve Judaism. By contrast, the Muslim sources wish to present Paul as a wicked Jew, taking the pure Islamic message of Jesus and corrupting it for various reasons. In both narratives, Paul is first and foremost a Jew. Both narratives are not really about Christianity. For Jews, they are about preserving Jewish faith from threat. For Muslims, their narratives of Paul as plotter are an example, a warning against letting Islam be corrupted, as I stated earlier. Now, as Sarah Strumsa has put it, quote, in the triangular marketplace where Muslims, Christians and Jews set up their doctrinal booths, the arguments brought up in the discussion, both oral and written, served as currency, quickly changing hands. The exact value of a given coin can only be learned if one follows its course from hand to hand. What other implications arise from the image of Paul as corrupter of Christianity? First, for the text of the New Testament. Now, it's interesting that there's almost no discussion I've found about Paul in this context which brings in implications for the New Testament. These things are usually discussed in terms of Christian doctrine and the rise of early Christian history and stories about it. Excuse me. And in fact, in early Muslim writings, we're talking 700s, 800s, there's relatively little explicit focus and energy given to the corruption of the New Testament text You can say it's there implicitly, and that's a focus of other interesting studies, but it's not really a major topic. But if Paul is a deceiver, the reliability of any section of the New Testament associated with Paul can scarcely even be considered. Which is why Abdul-Jabbar, for example, barely even mentions the issue in his account of the corruption of Christianity. He barely mentions the New Testament text issue. It's obvious from his account of Paul as a deceiver that he couldn't accept such a view. He criticises Paul's writings as being collected in a book that he terms, well, you could call it the Apostolikon, if you like. The Arabic word is silih, which Gabriel Reynolds says is from a Syriac term, which was used both for the apostle, Paul, shliha is the term. It means apostle, but it also means the book of writings by Paul. The worthlessness of these writings in Abdul-Jabbar's view is perhaps so obvious that his only comment on the letters, Paul's letters, relates to Christians' attitudes to them. Quote, "When his letters and discourse are read in the church, they, the Christians, stand venerating and exalting him and his discourse. They do not do this for the Torah, nor during the Gospels." Unquote. Secondly, for interfaith relations, what are we to make of a figure like Paul who has no exact equivalent in Islam? He is seen by Christians as a source of scripture, but he is not the founding figure itself. In what ways can Muslims come to terms with Paul, if at all, if there's no scriptural commitment or demand for his vilification within Islam? In other words, he's not really mentioned in the Quran or Hadith, as I said at the outset. Is there, particularly because of his attitude to law and his assertion of the crucifixion and resurrection of Christ, there are very major theological issues, but there's no necessary commitment to him being a conspirator. And we need to distinguish between Paul as being in error and Paul the hypocritical deceiver. And something I'd like to do is to look more at tracing, what emerges. As I say, in the 20th century, it seems to me that the idea of Paul as conspirator, I haven't really researched this thoroughly yet, is not so dominant. You have Paul who's just mistaken. But that's a very provisional comment. I'm not sure about that. Certainly you get the idea of Paul as plotter later on. There's a new book out, a study of another Muslim who wrote extensive work against Christianity, Al-Qarafi. It's here. Another work from Brill, Shihab ad-Din al-Qarafi, and he has, again, similar accounts about Paul the conspirator. He died in 1285, so again we're moving forward in time. So these accounts of Paul provide the most convenient explanation for the Muslim narrative about what happened to the teachings of the Islamic Jesus, although I said the conspiracy narratives are not the only story. Sometimes it's just he made a mistake. I'm sure there are other implications that I've perhaps not yet discerned, so at that point I will pause and welcome comments and questions and additions. Thank you.
Okay, so just to recap what he's saying here is this person, Saif bin Omar, from 796 to 809, came up with the idea that Paul was, and the account of Paul is much earlier than most Muslim accounts of Paul. So this is the earliest account, Saif. By the way, Saif is spelled this way, Saif bin Omar. He was the earliest account, and he was a corrupter of true religion, and he used lies. He's a king and that kind of thing. And some Jews have gone over to the enemy, basically to Christianity, and the Jews basically, let's see what else it says here. Paul's plan then was to cause the Christians to be damned by introducing a false version of their faith, and thereby to save the Jews so that the Jews will not be attracted to it. Okay, so he deliberately was trying to blow up Christianity to protect his love for Judaism. Okay, so this is the good Jew theory. And that's what's the first theory of Islam was Paul was a good Jew. He was trying to protect the Jewish people. And so what is he doing? Paul's introducing false teachings, which he is attaching to the teachings of Jesus. I mean, it's preposterous to think that Jesus could be a valid prophet if he teaches anything that Paul teaches. Yeah, the law is given by angels through a mediator. Why do you want to be in bondage anymore to these weak and beggarly celestial beings? That's Galatians 3:19 and Galatians 4:9. And this is what I say: we're the dumbest as Gentiles. We're so dumb because we don't understand. A Jewish person would look at this and be horrified. There's just no way this is a religion they can even think about, conceive of. Even if Jesus was genius and brilliant and wonderful and had a lot of great stuff, it would prevent Jews from being attracted to it, just as he said. That was the first thesis. And what was the second thesis? The second major thesis came 300 years later. Abdul-Jabbar, 1025 Christian era. He was the most famous classical Muslim account of Paul as a corrupter and conspirator, but for what end? For the Roman Empire. So this actually has more credibility than, but the other one is explicable that the first theory that Paul is trying to protect Judaism makes sense in the sense that the high priest who was co-opted by the Herodians, they appointed the high priest in that era from all the way from Herod the Great in 4 BC all the way up to post Jesus, by at least till the fall of the temple. They were always appointed by the Herodians. So the high priest could have a motivation that would look like he's trying to protect Judaism, but he's really trying to protect Rome. But anyway, this Abdul-Jabbar just overtly says that's what he was doing. He was trying to protect Rome, and he says, let's just remember what he says, that he was referring to early Christians had joined the side of the Romans. So there was some Christians who wanted to be on the side of Rome and pulled the movement to be pro-Rome, and the ruling power was with them. So if you want power, you could use the Christians as a power base that you would be influential in that region. And to that end, Paul perverted the true gospel teaching, and he entangled himself in the group and became a powerful leader, and that was his goal. Paul went over to the Romans to oppose the Jews. That is a desire for power and dominance, so it's a very kind of basic instinct. So this is anti-Jewish. See, so he's pro-Roman, anti-Jewish. So that's theory 2. So either he's pro-Jewish and is deliberately doing a poison pill, or he's deliberately changing this group so it can be under his control. Paul, under his control, would be controlling Christianity, and he'd become a power broker, and therefore he could undermine the Jews. So that would be the second way. But Rome was not inimical to the high priest's office. So again, there was a cooperation between the high priest and Rome, and that is how you can synthesize both these two theories could be simultaneously true. All right. God bless everybody. Take care. Ciao. Bye.